Discover over 100 episodes of Bartholomew Town on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the Bartholomew Town podcast.
It all blew up, and suddenly this very wholesome activity of reading to children becomes this big thing. Well, let me say this. I think your listeners may be aware that for a lot of people, police do not equal safety.
Welcome in to another edition of the Bartholomew Town podcast. I'm your host, Bill Bartholomew. On today's episode, my wide-ranging conversation with activist and performer Naomi Chomsky. Naomi Chomsky, a Rhode Island-based activist and performer who recently found themselves in the regional and even national media spotlight at the center of what somehow became a controversial event, Drag Queen Story Hour in Fall River, Massachusetts. And this ultimately slipped over the border to Bristol, Rhode Island. Rogers Free Library was scheduled to have a Drag Queen Story Hour themselves on June 15th. That was ultimately canceled. The library caved to pressure, and then after experiencing embarrassment for canceling the event, it was ultimately put back on the schedule. So really just a back and forth, but at the same time, sort of a clash of ideals right here in Rhode Island. So we'll get to all of that with Naomi Chomsky, plus a whole lot more affecting Rhode Islanders and beyond. Stay tuned. A fascinating conversation today here on B-Town. Support for Bartholomew Town comes from High Hope, located at 38 Broadway in downtown Newport, Rhode Island. Discover more at highhoperi.com. And remember, you can support Bartholomew Town by subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening right now. All right, without further ado, my wide-ranging conversation with Naomi Chomsky. Let's just get right into kind of within the last month, this situation at the Bristol, the Rogers Free Library, where there's a back and forth. There was a Drag Queen Story Hour event booked that was scheduled and promoted, and you were scheduled to read to kids, and then because of some kind of board pressure, internal parochial pressure, it was canceled. Then there was sort of an uproar of sensible people coming to the forefront, and it ultimately went on. Is that kind of what the story
I actually
is?
was never the queen that was going to do Bristol. My event in Fall River was something that was organized completely separately. I sort of had a vague idea that something was going on in Bristol, but then they canceled the last week of May, and that's when Kurt Schilling tweeted about me personally. This is all happening while I was in LA, and I was just like, what the hell is happening here?
Yeah.
And it all blew up, and suddenly this very wholesome activity of reading to children becomes this big thing. So my Fall River wasn't going to ever cancel the event. That's what the librarian told me the day of. They really stood by it. So did mayor and city council and all the elected officials. They wanted to make sure that this happened and that the Fall River's first Pride celebration went without incident, and it did. It was a great event. And so, the next week, Bristol reinstates their story time.
Yeah, surprise.
Yeah. There was an uproar in the community, but I think the focus of that uproar was to find a different location for it. But it ended up happening, and from what I can see, it was just kind of the same. I talked to the queen after, and she was like, yeah, there were a couple of people outside praying, but they didn't give us any trouble. So,
yeah,
it ended up being just fine, as it turns out.
Yeah, it's shocking. It was shocking to me. I've had a couple experiences with Drag Queen Story Hour when I was in New York and then in Newport, doing an event there, and it's
not a new thing.
It's not a new thing at all. And it just sort of spoke to a certain segment of the population that just doesn't want to do their homework and would rather just kind of lean on playing to these extreme fears and
One of those people is the Bishop of the Archdiocese of Providence.
I mean, yeah, with Tobin. I mean, if someone asked me, is there anyone you wouldn't really want to talk to on the podcast? And he's the only person who came to mind as, at this point, I think I'd be willing to talk to John DePietro, on and on. It would go. There's a lot.
You're willing to talk to him? That's very big of you.
I think so before, but Tobin, I don't think there's anything left. I mean, look at this guy. I mean, what is he doing?
I don't know, up in his ivory tower or whatever. Yeah, I mean, the part about especially it being harmful for children was really what got me on that comment, And he's actually dead wrong about it because, I think what he may or may not realize is that there's a lot of gender confused children or children who may not have the language for it, but are going to grow up queer, and to see themselves represented in the library and on TV. I mean, I think that's actually going to save a lot of lives.
Yeah, it's going to literally save a lot of lives, and it's going to provide that opportunity for awakening and for self authenticity at an earlier point in life.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm a little bit older. I'm 34. For me, my queer role models were Will and Grace, and later Queer as Folk. I mean, they aren't exactly the best. They're a little bit like white people stereotypes. But you know what? It was a representation, and it was more than the previous generation had.
Yeah. Do you feel a sense of responsibility at this point in human history and where we are in these last years and where we're heading in terms of the culture, the dynamics of the country with the strong divide on some social issues? I mean, do you feel a responsibility to sort of dial things in and try to bring a broader awakening to people? I mean, or do you feel like this is more of a, you're in a contentious situation, pushing back against you hate to say it, but almost an enemy?
Yeah, I mean, well, they are the enemy. That's for sure. But I do feel a certain responsibility. I mean, from the time I graduated high school, I was marching against the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
I feel like I do feel a certain responsibility to stand up for what's right always. And, this happens to affect me on a personal level. I didn't expect it to be such a situation where I would be all over the news media from not just Providence, but Boston and beyond. Yeah, I mean, I was even on InfoWars, Alex Jones' tinfoil hat show.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But I mean, it was part being in a contentious situation where I really had no choice but to be the face of Story Hour in New England, even though today I've done 2 Story Hours and I have a third coming, but somehow my face became the face of Story Hour here in New England, and it was sort of I was forced to fight for what's right and not be gaslit into saying things, because folks were poking at me, asking these reckless questions.
Yeah. Let's talk about, today in Rhode Island right now. Do you feel comfortable here? I mean, there's a lot of talk of this being an inclusive and creative space. I feel that there is a lot of that, but there's also a lot of barriers in Rhode Island between neighborhoods and different communities. I mean, just as a human being, do you feel like culturally Providence, Rhode Island, we're in a sound place?
Well, that's a difficult question because there's definitely some economic, economic differences between, say, I don't know, this is 2 extreme examples, but Olneyville and the East Side, that will never be right to me. But at the same time, I mean, I can live my best queer life downtown, and I live in Federal Hill. I feel comfortable walking down the street as a visibly queer person. And that's really good. I mean, and you always get some asshole who's gonna, yell faggot at you out the car, but then at least they're the asshole, you know?
Right. No doubt.
You know,
about
whereas
it, yeah.
like growing up in Tiverton, you know, I don't know, and I had a good experience for like a queer person growing up in a small town.
Yeah. Did you go to Tiverton High School?
I did. I graduated in '04, and I felt like I should have been bullied more than I was, but you know, whatever. I guess it comes with confidence because I was also pretty confident.
That it totally comes with confidence. I think that's
Like you couldn't
That's
say
it.
anything about me that I already didn't say about myself, and that's
Right.
still true today. But you know, the main difference is if someone as me walking down the streets in Tiverton as a visibly queer person, it's just a little bit of a different dynamic. You don't feel like you have your neighbors backing, whereas here I do.
yeah, in Providence, in Providence Metro.
Yeah, in Providence. Can't even venture too far out of Providence, to be honest, because there's some scary places around here.
Well, we've got the gun sanctuary cities. We know the divide between, you know, essentially Trump country. I mean, you go to Johnston or Olneyville, you're going to find a different dynamic for sure, politically. And of course, you know, we were speaking on the way
Johnson
up.
and Olneyville are right there.
They're right there, yeah. I mean, even in growing up in Charahoe, Charlestown to Richmond and Hopkinton, strong differences. I was on the Charlestown side, and you know, in Tiverton as well. You see that. You know what I mean? There's no question about that. Those sort of rural, kind of regional conglomerations.
Very rural.
And
although there's a lot of like young professionals have moved in too.
yeah,
You see a lot of like yoga studios and such.
right. The Four Corners Art Galleries. And
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
always
it's-
been there, but it's expanding. It seems.
Yeah, it's expanding to, you know, and the Sandy Woods. A lot of art is coming out of there too.
Yep. Yeah, I've performed there. It's just like the Sandy Woods. It was supposed to be an artist community. It's just when you drive out there, you realize, man, that's difficult to attract.
Well,
people
right,
far out,
exactly,
that far
and
out.
also like, you know, also somewhat. I don't know. It's also somewhat illegal, especially when housing isn't really cheap in the Tiverton area, and you have some folks who, you know, work minimum wage jobs and need to be in Tiverton because their transportation isn't reliable or whatever. So, it still serves that function a little bit, but also serves as some like lower income housing. Although they're nice, you know, my uncle lives there.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've seen the interior of
I've
the
seen the
structures.
interior of one of them, yes.
Yeah. Let's, as far as Tiverton politics, just real quick. Town council, I mean, there's always things going on there. You got Justin Katz, and it seems like one peer group, and then you got another peer group. You got the Tiverton Pulse, and, you know, what's going on in Tiverton from your perspective?
I mean, from my perspective, I must admit, I don't follow the politics closely anymore. My mom's a teacher, and she's always, you know, telling me to support one budget over another. You know, but I'm registered to vote here in Providence, but there seems to be, you know, and I noticed it really when the whole Tea Party thing was happening. There was sort of like a mini Tea Party in Tiverton.
Oh, is that right?
The vanguard of the taxpayer.
Yeah, it makes sense.
You know, and I get it. You know, Tiverton relies on property taxes. It's very expensive. It's a nice place to live. Not a lot of like, you know, not a lot of corporate base to tax from. So shit's hard, but you gotta fund your schools.
Right.
You know, it's actually illegal to not fund schools. So
How about Providence right now? The mayor told a group of reporters that I was with yesterday that the city's in danger of running out of cash by July 15th. We've got the budget back and forth now between the council and the mayor. I mean, a lot of this might just be, you know, theater of the mind, but at the same time, Providence.
You know, there's always money to pay the cops. Find that really interesting. But when it comes to firefighters and teachers, you know, yeah, I mean, but also, you know, most of Providence's taxable land belongs to Lifespan. It belongs to Brown, J-Woo, you know, and like for Lifespan to call itself a nonprofit is laughable. If you've ever gotten a bill from Rhode Island Hospital,
Right.
you'll know that Lifespan is very much for profit. And they should probably be paying taxes on it.
Yeah, I pondered one time. I mean, this isn't a serious thought, but, would Providence be better off without Brown and RISD, and taking the buildings back? I mean, obviously it's ridiculous, and I don't want to see Brown go away at all.
No,
I know
of
that it
course.
can't go away, and it's so important.
But at the same time, Brown really doesn't, students who go to Brown are majority not from Rhode Island, and majority don't stay in Rhode Island. So it really doesn't do, the Rhode Island economy very much good.
Right. It just attracts. It builds adds to the tourism. It adds to the
it's nice.
intangibles.
I mean, it's nice to have all these visitors from around the world come in, but that's not the end all be all of a quote unquote world class city.
What is the missing ingredient right now? Looking at Rhode Island, we're in the budget conversations there too. In fact, everyone's in the State House as we record this, hashing out the details. No pun intended, because I think they're working on weed first.
I know. Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that the Reproductive Health Care Act passed. I think that's great. The governor promised to expand the free tuition program. I think that'll that could affect me personally, actually. I think there's a whole bunch of investment that we need to make in, not just young Rhode Islanders, but people who, maybe for one reason or another ended up not graduating college, are working these dead end jobs, or stuck in a cycle, can't afford to go back to school. I think investment needs to be made there, because there's a lot of people in that situation, and there may be kids involved, and retraining. Also, I mean, can we talk about how healthcare should be a right? That's true that's true of the whole country, though. I mean, it's time. It's high time, because, and I'm doing a fundraiser for a friend who recently became ill and doesn't have insurance. And it just seems so incredibly maddening that, in a country where, with the military budget we outspend people on the military, 2-to-1 from our nearest competitor, and we can't provide health care. Something's not right. Our priorities are messed up.
Yeah, and you think about military as the economic stimulus here in Rhode Island, that factor, the way that the cycle, if you will, you really would have to break down and reevaluate the foundations, the bedrocks of the entire economy to make something like that happen. Now, at the same time, there's no reason why we can't talk about
somebody's
that.
Somebody's starting to sound like a socialist. Wow. I think I read that in a pamphlet somewhere. Yeah, I think, Marxists are often accused of saying that boiling everything down to capitalism, but it kind of does.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, capitalism in its purest sense, just the capital K, is not fundamentally evil, and doesn't, I look at it as, I try to find the balance between anarcho-syndicalism and capitalism. Where does that live? Where the producers are rewarded and the system makes those rewards such that they have value. You know what I mean? How can you bridge that? But when the means of production lose not only power, but lose the ability to make a living wage, I mean, that's not capitalism anymore. That's something else.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at.
Yeah, it's we live in some interesting times, don't we? Very interesting times.
Yeah. What do you have planned going forward? I mean, how you're not you're not a lobbyist. You're not one of the people that's going to be at the State House every day knocking on doors.
I've been known to show up, but I'm not a lobbyist.
Nope.
I'm an activist, first and foremost, and that's what I plan on remaining.
What are the top things you're concerned about right now, Ron?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I was concerned about with just passed was the Reproductive Health Care Act. I'm just going to continue, Pride just happened. That was intense. There's a big, actually, interestingly enough, there's a big conversation going on in the LGBTQI community about the role that cops play at Pride.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and that's a long conversation.
We
But
can have, it's basically that the stories, the Warwick police, whether the communication breakdown happened, where it happened, who's responsible for that. Regardless, the Warwick police, they put a police car in with flashing lights in the parade against the wishes of the community that were sort of outlined, not sort of, that were outlined ahead of this parade.
I was made aware of this, of like the condition under which police could march in the parade back in May. And I didn't love it, but I could live with it.
Yeah. Well, there was some vocal, at least Facebook events created sort of surrounding this.
There were 2 community listening sessions in which the crux of the bulk of the conversation was around, we don't want to see cops in our Pride parade. We don't want to see cops at our Pride festival at all. We realize that, we can't have a festival that size without cops, but we don't have to welcome them in our parade.
Tell the listeners, expand on that concept, of what the main tipping point is for you there, who that affects.
Okay, so I think, well, let me say this. I think your listeners may be aware that for a lot of people, police do not equal safety. They come into communities of color, who are scared already. There's people dealing with immigration issues. So, like, seeing uniformed police celebrated at this thing sends the wrong message that maybe they're not welcome or, whatever. But it's, and I'm using my voice to echo their concerns. And it's not a new conversation. We've been having it since 2016. So Pride is now at least somewhat listening now. And I give them a lot of credit for that.
The context of it is something that I totally understand. Mm-hmm. Having lived in poor neighborhoods in New York, living in Elmwood now, just communicating with different people, doesn't matter, what you want to believe, but there is an imbalance in law enforcement that law enforcement knows about for sure, and they understand at a certain level.
Not all cops are bad or whatever, but all bads are cops. But even like the quote unquote good cops are complicit in a system that perpetuates inequality and poverty. And the separation of families,
and on that side of it, you're totally right. You make that choice whether or not you're going to make.
And then when
you're
you
going
put
to work
on that
uniform,
job,
right?
Yeah, when you put on that uniform, you're a traitor to your community. I don't care if you're a queer cop, or I don't care if you're a queer person who's a cop. But the moment you put on that uniform, you're no longer serving your LGBT brothers and sisters.
How do we build a society that works against mob rule, though, if we don't have an element of law enforcement that's, and again, it doesn't have to look or be what we see today as the police force, that they could change in its shape, but how do you construct that? I'm talking big picture here, not tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
How do you build that?
So, but if you look at what constitutes most crimes in the society, they are crimes of desperation. They're crimes of poverty. They're crimes of the system, that this system perpetuates. So, to talk about an alternative to the the current prison industrial complex model, you have to fundamentally change society. I believe that 100%. But, there are outliers. Like the first thing people think of are violent crimes, which are extremely rare. But will still happen even under, even if we had a socialist system, it would still happen every once in a while. And I think it's on the community to form its own sense of justice and what that means and how, so the answer is we can prevent most crimes by changing the system, which sounds simpler than it is.
Yeah, it's pushing the boulder up the hill,
And then, like, for the rest, we'll just have to figure it out. I don't think we need to, like, physically remove most most people.
Right. Do you feel, what's your take on, guns? I mean, are you, if you had such a situation, would you want everybody armed to create this, like a mob? Just self-policing.
Yeah. I don't love guns, but I also, like, understand that gun control has a really sordid racist history. The first gun control laws were enacted in California and were aimed at the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And so there's that. But at the same time, gun culture in this country is like, the right certainly controls the narrative on gun legislation. Like, it's a weird thing for me to navigate to say, like, no, I'm not totally down with gun control, but also not with those fuckers.
Oh yeah, no, I think they do so much harm for the Second Amendment. Because when you have a reasoned discussion about it, the reality is that it's not this. It's a major issue and it's controversial, and you can have your opinions about it, and that's fine. But there is a middle ground to be had.
There
and
is,
it would
yeah.
make it seem there isn't.
But like, do I think folks need assault weapons? No, I don't think anyone needs assault weapons. That's
right.
That's the other thing too. The gun control crowd is always like, well, we don't need weapons of war in our streets. I'm like, wait, so these weapons of war are not okay for our streets, but are okay in, like, Yemen or Iran. Like, what are you saying here?
Right, that inconsistency on what the purpose of manufacturing such a device to begin with is. Yeah,
it was meant to, if it was meant to mow down people, then why make it?
That's right. Big questions. I mean, do you think Rhode Island can think that far out, or are we too caught up on whether or not we're gonna have the money to properly fund DCYF, or we're gonna put tolls in? I mean, we're gonna these types of things.
We certainly have a lot of work to do.
We can't really think that esoterically as much as we want to.
No, I mean, it's right. I mean, it's gonna be a series of events that would spark debate nationally and internationally. To make the kind of we can't do it. We can't do it by ourselves.
In our lifetimes, we're about the same age. Actually, we're the exact same age when we're talking about. You're 34.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're the same age. Do you think we're going to see it?
I think if someone had asked Lenin that question in 1914, I think he would have laughed at you. And just 3 years later, the Russian Revolution happened. So I hope so, but I don't know.
What's the key element of the original concept of the United States, that's slipped away from us right now that we need to get back to before we can take another massive step in terms of reconstructing? I mean, I feel like it's going to be tough to blow the whole thing up unless it literally happens.
Well, we never finished the job of reconstruction. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, do you feel like the Confederate leader should have been tried and hung? I mean, should it have gone that far?
Yeah, I'm not going to say no.
Yeah, so there is this divide that's only a couple of generations back.
Radical
still there.
Reconstruction was a thing, and for a while, black folks are getting elected to things, and it was very quickly ended, though, and we've been paying the price ever since.
Reparations, is that where it starts?
Yeah, absolutely. People have been demanding it for a long time. Why not? The economic impact of slavery is still felt today.
In terms of the industrial perspective and the leaders of those industries at times.
Yeah, and the way that the prison industrial complex disproportionately affects communities of color. Yeah, absolutely. We need to talk about reparations and to bring people on an equal economic footing. And to just like destroy casual racism in all of our conversations.
Casual racism, that's an interesting term. It makes so much sense, like right out of the gate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere you see. And like I noticed it more like watching Will and Grace back, you see it like, oh my God, we don't use that word anymore.
Think we're getting better and more aware as we get more connected, digitally?
I mean, I think so. People are reacting to it negatively because they have to change their behavior, and that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's tough when you still have generations that are, grew up in essentially the time where it's like black and white in your mind. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the color of the world, the photos and everything, and like the culture is, quote unquote, supposedly, so different back then. At the same time, you can't imagine having that perspective, a racist perspective of that magnitude at any point in history.
Yeah. Oh, you haven't, I imagine you haven't seen Tales of the City yet, the reboot. Oh, there's a scene where like this guy is an older gay man who's HIV positive who has a younger boyfriend of color, and he brings them to this dinner party with a whole bunch of like old white gays, and like one of them drops a T slur. And the young boyfriend was like, "Oh, I don't think we use that term anymore," and got his ass handed to him and got this whole lecture of like, "Well, you didn't live through the AIDS crisis, so you don't know." And it was just, and it was like a thing, and then, but like, yeah, like you went through all this stuff, but like what you're saying is still problematic and still racist. Like if you want to continue to push things forward, you have to examine your own behavior always. Yeah,
it's like you really have to be willing to reevaluate, and also there's a level of guilt that you can have, and you should have for sure. But you can work through that, and it should not be perpetual. Like that. No, that guilt is something you can break.
Guilt shouldn't be paralyzing. It should be a tool that you use to grow.
Right. And that's not white privilege either. The guilt's separate from that. That's you. That's on you that you feel. The white privilege is a societal fact that we've built up around.
It's there whether you want it or not.
So how you address it, I think that's what is unfair in the world right now, as far as that people associate guilt and feeling guilt or empathy even for actual substantial change, where it's a whole nother side of the fork in the road, if you will. That's your personal deal, the guilt and the empathy or whatever, your awakenings. But you still have to be willing to rethink the way we're doing business as a society and as human beings, and get involved. I mean, and getting involved isn't necessarily being an activist or anything like that either. No. It can just be the way you talk about the world, the way you describe things going forward.
Yeah, I mean, reading about the world and at least understanding people's perspectives.
Yeah, that's the key element. Last question: do you plan to stay in Providence? And
I have a second library reading at the Rochambeau Library, June 20th. I believe that's at noon. I don't remember the June 20th, Rochambeau Library.
That's a Thursday?
It's a Saturday.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, did I say June? July.
Okay, yeah, July. Yep.
July 20th at the Rochambeau Library. That's a Saturday.
Yeah. Kids are amazing too to perform for, right?
Oh my God. Kids just, they see like this giant person wearing bright colors. They're sold.
They're amazing. I performed for a bunch of kids last night. I wasn't even expecting it. I was playing at the Guild in Pawtucket, and I thought it would just be where. And there was, all the parents are getting drunk, so it's like a group of like a classroom of kids hanging out, so attentive and so just mesmerized by the movement. And I've seen, like I said, I've been a part of 2 drag queen story hours, in one in Brooklyn, one in Newport, and such an amazing event. Like, kids need that level of entertainment. It's become so digitized, a lot of the things they're experiencing on the screens.
There's also not a lot of opportunities for children to interact with drag queens.
Yeah, for real.
Because just because of the way drag is historically developed, it's mostly in bars, and and children are exposed to it on TV through RuPaul's Drag Race, and they want to be part of the magic. They love seeing this larger than life costumey, thing in front of them. It's fun. It's fun for adults, and why shouldn't it be fun for children?
That's all the time we have for today, but I'll be back on Tuesday with a brand new episode. And remember, you can find over 100 conversations with Rhode Island influencers at bartholomewtown.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Bill Bartholomew. We'll talk soon. Have a great weekend, everybody.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.